Okay, now for our interview with Wayne Weingarten. Congratulations on the new book, which I guess just came out recently, right?
It just came out. It was a co-authored book by the four of us, and I thought one of the great things about this book is we all come from different perspectives. So we were able to take a kind of a multidisciplinary look at the homeless problem, really try to understand where it came from, and by understanding what drives it, come up with actual solutions to help alleviate the problem.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, you're hoping to affect public policy with this book, although in California, good luck with that.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of good luck with that with California policies, quite frankly. But that's our goal. I think, remember the tax revolution of the '80s started in California with Prop 13. So, my hope is, we've got to keep talking about what the right solutions are. Free market solutions to address these problems. To use government effectively, but not have government be the answer. And if we keep pushing, if we keep researching, keep educating, we can get there.
Yeah,
I'm an optimist.
The California people are on your side. They've proven that by how they voted in the recent ballot initiatives in November, where they voted conservatively on like 5 or 6 very key things like rent control and so on, that they vote down, and affirmative action that they vote down. So it's the politicians that aren't listening.
Right. And so that's, but if you have the people, you'll eventually get the politicians.
Yeah.
That's my hope. And voting down rent control is incredibly important for homelessness too.
Right. Yeah, we'll get into all that. And, California may have a very important election coming up if the recall thing happens, which appears to be on course right now.
Yeah, as far as I know, we're exactly on course.
So we've covered homelessness a little bit on the show. I've written about it a couple times for Fox. So, it used to be California's number one issue before COVID, and it was going to be the issue, I think, that was going to define Newsom's governorship, as far as, whether everybody was going to see what he did on homelessness. And COVID, of course, sucks the air out of everything else. And now everything's about COVID. And of course, he's being judged on how he did with COVID. But before COVID, it was all about homelessness, and the problem has only gotten worse. I see it firsthand here in Venice, where I am at least once a week. And it's absolutely, for sure, the worst it's ever been since I've been seeing Venice for 30 years. So the need for the book is clearly there, and the need for solutions is there. Kind of starting from the beginning, I think we should start by defining homelessness. And the reason I say that is I've heard people define it differently. Your average person like me, who thinks of homeless, thinks of these people that are sleeping on the streets in Venice and on the sidewalks and on the beach and so on. But I've heard definitions that are much broader than that. And it's anybody who doesn't have a permanent address. So if I lost my job and I can't afford the rent, and I move in with my sister or my friend, and so I'm sleeping on the couch, or I'm sleeping in a spare bedroom or whatever, that person is defined as homeless. So did you guys nail down a specific definition of homeless? And when we get homeless counts out of California or out of LA County and so on, who is being included in these counts?
Well, when we looked at counts, we relied on housing, urban development, their counts of people out on the streets at the time that they did the count. The 2020, that was 161,000 people in California that were living on the streets. And that was, when we talked about homeless, kind of our focus on those people who are actually living on the streets. Now, when you have someone who's living with their sister, for, let's say, because they lost their job and can't afford, that is part of the problem of the situational homeless. And so helping address those on the street by improving affordability, we would help that group as well. But that's not where we focused. I mean, that is part of the process, and it's also part of the solution.
So you would call those people situational homeless?
No, we would call people who, if you are on the streets because of an economic reason or a life event reason, a divorce, a health issue that bankrupt you, that's more of a situational homeless. Distinguishing that, and it's really important to distinguish the different groups from someone who's homeless because of mental illness or substance abuse. And those issues of substance abuse led to their homelessness. And there's a large portion of the homeless today are not situational, which would be people who would respond to positive incentives, but are people who are suffering with addiction and suffering from mental illness, which creates a whole different kind of issues that you have to deal with in order to help them.
Okay. And so how do you break down those percentages? What percentage of the people sleeping on the sidewalks are situational versus chronic?
Well, I think one of the great things in the book, we all didn't agree on, well, prime drivers. So Chris Rufo, he would say the vast majority. He was one of our co-authors. He would say the vast majority of people on the street were because of addiction and substance and mental health illness. He refers to it as a perilous trifecta. And so he would say most of them. I'm an economist, so I tend to look at economic reasons. And I think affordability is an important issue as well. But if you look at the data, and this is really interesting, because homelessness as a problem was going down in California, just like it was in the US, up into about 2014. So after the mortgage crisis, homelessness went up, but we were getting things under control. So 2014 is a big year because that's where in California, homelessness was going up while it continued improving elsewhere. You also had at that pivotal year, legal changes, policy changes, and affordability changes in housing. So all of those drivers for both mental illness and substance abuse, and well as affordability, situational homeless, all got worse in 2014. So when I was talking about affordability, if you go with the basic financial recommendation that about 30% of your gross income should be devoted to housing. It's always a little above that in California, but it was going down after the crisis. It started going up in 2014, and now it's up 40, 50, 60%, depending upon where you live. So an incredible amount of your income has to go towards your housing, makes you much more financially vulnerable. At that same time, we were making policy changes that made it harder to help people who are substance abuse and addicted. So we have them more on the streets and less in hospitals that could help them. So you have both trends getting worse as of 2014.
Mm-hmm. So, I jotted down a few causes. I'm sure you would agree with these and tell me if I'm missing, but affordable housing being one, addictions being another, right? Mental illness being a cause. And then the one that I actually cite as number one, that I think you've just alluded to it, but curious your thoughts on it, is simply that it is allowed. If you allow something, you build it, they will come. You allow something, it will happen. If it's not allowed, then people have to do something else. They have to figure out something else. Now, they may wind up in jail, but they also may wind up in a treatment center. They also may wind up sleeping with a friend or family, reaching out and finding solutions. But when you make an easy solution, sleeping on the sidewalk or by the beach, which, by the way, a lot of people like living at Venice Beach. The homes are $10 million each to live on the beach. So, I know maybe it sounds, some people may call me callous to say that, oh, how could you suggest sleeping outside is something that people would want. But, there's a reason why there's 1,000 people sleeping on the beach in Venice. They choose Venice Beach because it's a nice place to be. But I think the allowing it thing, which is a change that I'm sure you're familiar with, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it in the past 5 or 6 years, is perhaps the biggest driver.
Yeah, one of the co-authors, Joseph Tarkovsky, he's a lawyer, and he goes through this very carefully, talking about how the legal environment has changed drastically. So that where you used to have vagrancy laws, and you would literally, 1800, run people out of town. And how that's evolved into, and I don't know if you were referring to the Boise decision at the Ninth Circuit, which is essentially creating, and I think it is actually creating a right to live on the streets that didn't exist before. And that is a very important cause, because now you're at a situation where law enforcement, they really can't, have someone who is sleeping on the streets, violating vagrancy laws, unless you can be certain that there's a bed available for that person. You can't move them. And they don't have the information to know whether or not there is a bed available. And so it's evolved into that essential right, effective, I should say, right to live on the street. And when you combine that with other legal changes like Prop 47, where you can, essentially steal, and you can steal up to $950, it'd be a misdemeanor. And so people aren't going to enforce it. The cops aren't enforcing it. And so now not only do you have a right to live on the street, but you have a means to support a drug habit. And so if you're addicted and your addiction has led you to the streets, but you're happy sleeping on the beach or wherever it might be, and you have a means to get money to feed your addiction, we've now enabled a destructive lifestyle. Whereas if you had a different system that, not necessarily take them to jail, that was one of the things that Chris Rufo writes a lot about, which is that we've gotten rid of these asylums because they were awful places and needed reform. But what we've done instead is just throwing people on the street, and instead of being in a mental institution that could help them, you're either going to jail or living on the street, or perhaps in a shelter bed, but you're cycling amongst those areas, and we're not actually helping people with the mental illness kind of address those mental illness or address their addiction. So it's enabling that destructive lifestyle that created the wrong type of positive incentive, right? Retain a positive incentive to be homeless on the street, which is the exact opposite of what we want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just so people are aware, and I have talked about it before, but yeah, this Boise decision basically said that it is cruel and unusual punishment to, I guess, imprison or fine someone for sleeping out on the street unless you can show that the state is providing available housing for this person. So it's really, as you're pointing, it's putting an obligation on the government to house all of its citizens, because unless you've got that available for them, they are allowed to sleep wherever they want to sleep, and you can't protect your parks, you can't protect your sidewalks, etc., to allow families to enjoy them. You can't walk your kid down the streets in Venice right now. It's not safe to take your children to Venice. So this beach that's supposed to be there for the public to enjoy, we cannot enjoy, because under this court ruling, Los Angeles doesn't have enough housing to house everybody for free, and therefore they have to be allowed to sleep on the sidewalks.
Yeah, it really does. And that was one of the things, and Joseph does a wonderful job going through this, but you see this legal evolution, which you could say, in my opinion, it was way too harsh on the one end, but as opposed to finding a reasonable place where we can actually help people, we swung the pendulum completely to the other side.
Mm-hmm. So what do we see in other countries as far as the extent of the homeless problem versus U.S. and in particular California? And what are the solutions that you see out there that other countries or other states are doing that California needs to adopt?
Yeah, I mean, we focus mostly on other states rather than other countries, and since it's such a multidimensional problem, the solutions have to be multidimensional. I think that's the first thing we have to realize. There's no easy solution. There's no silver bullet that just we need to do this one thing and we'll have it solved. I think we need to address each cause and target that cause, target the regulations that are driving up costs and leading to these outcomes. We definitely need legal reform. And then we also need to leverage the private sector. There's some brilliant nonprofits that do a much better job of sustainably helping people. One that we highlight in the book, it's called Shelters to Shutters. It's actually headquartered in Vienna, Virginia. And they focus more on the situational homeless, where instead of just getting someone who's homeless a place to stay, they focus on getting them a job, so that you're creating a sustainable path for them. So it's not that they're just in a home, but they now have a way to actually, pay for their home and to kind of re-engage in society and re-engage, kind of get back on that path to prosperity. And so that holistic perspective, a lot of the private nonprofits are able to take that, and they're also much more flexible, right? So that they're able to learn, they're able to adopt their policies to fit the needs of the particular homeless population they're serving. The government programs just don't demonstrate that type of flexibility, that type of innovation. So one of the things we suggest is to provide services, we have to rely more on the nonprofits.
Yeah. How do we encourage that? Because, I've always said that, the best type of charity is not coming from the government, but good old fashioned charities, the local churches, keeping things local where you really understand the issues in your community. I mean, trying to set solutions that come from Sacramento or DC when every community's problem is so different just doesn't work. Here where I live in Pacific Palisades, I've talked about before, a little local group was set up with donations from local homeowners because people don't like to step over homeless people as you're walking to the beach. And it's an outreach program, and they have like 6 full-time staff that all they do is talk to the homeless every single day, trying to build their trust, understanding their issue, and then ultimately encouraging them and getting them to agree that, yes, I'll go into a shelter. And then they find the shelter for them. And then they even follow up with them on the shelter. And guess what? Homelessness in Pacific Palisades is down 50%, whereas it's up everywhere else in the city of Los Angeles. In Pacific Palisades is actually down 50% as a result of this little group of 5 or 6 people working.
And that's exactly those programs, that type of positive incentives. Those are the successes you see elsewhere. They're implementing those types of programs. There's a day room that it's out of Kentucky, which has been very successful, where they provide services that homeless people would need: a shower, ability to plug in a phone, things of that nature. But they use that interaction as a way to interact with the homeless and to get them to the services they need. So you provide a means to have a positive connection, and that then gets them to the services they need. Helps obviously the homeless, because now they can move on and address their own issues and kind of get back into shelter. And obviously helps the community, helps the economy. So it's really a win-win situation. You're talking about what can the government do? Part of it is outsource the shelters too, so that you have, instead of the government running shelters, use that money to support the private shelters.
Yeah, it's just, it's the never let a good crisis go to waste mentality, it seems, that the left likes to follow. And rather than common sense solutions, they're going to use this as an opportunity to implement pet policies that couldn't be implemented otherwise. So
that's right.
If
a pet policy, and that's not going to solve the crisis.
Yeah. So rent control is something that you see that comes out as a solution to the homeless problem. Building more affordable housing, government housing, is a solution to the homeless problem. These big government policies coming out of DC and Sacramento.
Right. And one of the things you see is that those are just ineffective. The affordable housing, it costs so much to build affordable housing because of all the regulations. Because of the zoning regulations, you can't get anything built for years. If we have 161,000 people on the streets of California, and it takes 4 years or 5 years or whatever it takes to build affordable housing, how is that a solution in the here and now? I mean, they're great talking points, and I think one of the things that the left, the progressives have mastered is getting their policies judged based on the intentions. It's the House Everyone Act, and we're going to judge it based on the name of the act, not are you actually housing people. And so and when you base it on that, rent control, it reduces the supply of housing and increases the cost of housing and leads to more homelessness. So if you're going to expand rent control as a solution to homelessness, all you're going to do is increase the number of homeless people. CEQA, right? It's supposed to be there to help with the environment. It's the biggest barrier we have right now in the state to build housing. And it's a huge cost increase, and it's a huge time delay. If we don't reform things of that nature, affordable housing will continue to be an oxymoron in the state, and you won't solve the homelessness problem.
Yeah. Well, that's what they're doing. They're building housing for the homeless. I think it's coming out to a cost of about $700,000 per, 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And,
more expensive than the average apartment in the cities.
Yeah. Well, look, anytime the government builds something, you can assume there's going to be massive inefficiency, not to mention likely corruption as far as who gets the work and the payoff to politicians from these companies, and then, to campaign contributions and all kinds of nonsense. And then where do they build it? They build the shelter right in the heart of Venice, 1 block from the beach. And their answer is, well, that's because that's where all the homeless are. We're going to build it there. But I'm like, you chose the most expensive real estate in the city of Los Angeles, not to mention one of our biggest tourist destinations for Los Angeles. And right in the center of Venice, they're building this massive homeless shelter, as opposed to putting it in a far less expensive area of Los Angeles.
You would almost be better off just selling those units off as a private apartment to fund 2 shelters more inland.
Now that's spoken like a real free market economist. You're right. Those would go for $2 million each, based on the location of this thing.
Right, and that's the government ways. That's why we need, again, outsourcing to private nonprofits, so we get away from that type of nonsense. The more it's funding, the private groups, the less waste that's going to be, and the government can focus on managing the contracts. Government's very good at giving away money. Let them to focus on what they're good at, and let the organizations that have demonstrated ability to actually help the homeless have the resources to do what's necessary.
Mm-hmm. So as you kind of tick through the various causes and then therefore the solutions, again, I mean, I don't know if you agree with me. I think the number one thing is the fact that we allow it. But at least California and some of these Western states were under this court ruling that says that you have to have sufficient housing in order to enforce no sleeping on the sidewalk. So how do we traverse that?
Well, one thing is San Diego has like a very innovative kind of tent shelter, which is more of a temporary shelter, and you have the climate to be able to do that. And we need to leverage law enforcement officers better, so that they actually are aware of where the beds are, so that even within this strict ruling, if they are aware of where some shelter beds are, then within that restrictive legal kind of ruling, you could still take away that right to sleep on the street because you've met that requirement. So there is, and like in San Francisco, for instance, I mean, they're spending $100 million a year cleaning up the streets. If we could devote that money to actual shelters, and I know there's a transition issue that needs to be bridged, but you could create beds with the amount of money that you're actually funding in the cleanup, and then from there, you're going to be complicit with the ruling. And I would actually turn to you. I'm not a lawyer, but I think there has to be a way that this issue gets challenged. Maybe ideally there's a ruling in a different circuit that contradicts, so it can go up to the Supreme Court. But ideally we need this ruling reversed, because it makes the job so much harder. It's
a horrendous ruling. It's by an appellate court, so it's going to be hard to get it overturned in the Ninth Circuit. I think you're right. You probably need another circuit to rule the other way. Interestingly, the city of Los Angeles actually joined in the appeal in an attempt to get it to the Supreme Court, because as liberal as Los Angeles is, even it realized that this is kind of an untenable requirement. Part of their issue is just how do you even demonstrate that we've got enough, and how you measure that, because the number of homeless is constantly changing and how much housing you've got is constantly changing. Right. But yeah, in the interim, I guess we need to put together, some type of very short-term housing. You're saying that San Diego was able to do it through a kind of a tent city. But if we got there, then what are you and your team suggesting as far as police interaction with these people that are sleeping on the sidewalk? So, the rule is, after sundown, you can't be on the sidewalk, you can't be loitering, you can't be on the beach, you can't be in a tent, you can't be in a sleeping bag, et cetera. So it would require the police to come in, and then they would do what? Arrest them?
Well, I think, and these are the very difficult questions that we face, right? I mean, are you going to have a scene of cops dragging people off of the beach? And are we willing to withstand that? I think there is a middle ground. For instance, and this again takes a legal change, but if Prop 47 were repealed, and I know we just lost on that issue, but if we were somehow to be able to repeal it, and you had somebody that stole $500, $600, $700 worth of goods, charge him with a felony. But an idea which I'm personally in favor of, which I think could be very impactful, and actually the ABA supports it as well, which is the idea of homeless courts. So that instead of going through the legal system, you would go to a homeless court, which could actually sentence, quote unquote, somebody to treatment. So if you have a substance abuse issue, instead of, and if you've stolen, using that as an opportunity, just like we have a positive incentive with the day beds, use the negative interaction as an opportunity to get them into treatment, so that you're sentencing them to treatment. If they successfully complete it, then you can expunge their record, and hopefully that then in a position where they can re-engage in society and get back on track and get their lives moving forward, as opposed to being stuck in that drug addiction. And because you expunge their record, it's not a black mark that sticks with them forever. So I think being innovative in that way could help alleviate the problem without having that, you can imagine the cameras going off of people being dragged off the beach, and avoiding that type of situation.
Yeah. Essentially kind of a traffic court for homeless, which, I do think that's a good idea. I mean, I imagine in the past that we've arrested people. I think what they've been doing lately, at least before this decision, was they would first issue a ticket, but then of course the person never appears.
Right.
So then I guess what you would do is, well, if they don't appear and then they find them again, now it's time to be arrested. You gave them an opportunity to go voluntarily. I have an anecdotal story of a guy who used to do a bunch of work for me, just kind of a handyman kind of guy, and wound up with a major drug addiction and is sleeping out in the streets because of his drug addiction. And that I can attest to 1,000%. This guy had plenty of work as a handyman, but he got hooked on methamphetamine, and I saw him in his deranged condition. It's not pretty. And his family, he's got 4 children and a wife and parents, and they don't know where he is. He's out in the street, and the father goes out looking for him every day. And sometimes he does find him, but he can't get the police. He wants the police to arrest him because it's actually worked before. When he was arrested and then spent 30 days in jail, he got clean and sober. And that was the only way he was going to get clean and sober. So the father wants that to happen, but he can't get his kid arrested.
Yeah. And that's what we need to use the legal system. And sometimes you need a negative stick, right? Sometimes you need that negative interaction to help people because they're just not in a position to help themselves. And I think that's a very important part of the solution. Is you can call it tough love, but you need to actually, use the breaking of the law and the lawlessness as a means to get the people into a system that can help them.
Yeah. And we got to somehow wrestle these people up to help themselves. Again, if you make it comfortable to sleep in a sleeping bag, then your drug addiction lifestyle or whatever your lifestyle, it's just that much easier to live it, but if they're stirred up a bit by police interaction or whatever, it just seems to me that they're going to be more inclined to find a solution, perhaps even on their own, that the government doesn't need to solve it for them. But if you could get them clean, or at least get them realizing that I can't stay here, they have family members somewhere, most likely family members that probably kind of gave up on them. Just to go back to this anecdotal story, because I'm sure it's not anecdotal. The family gave up on this guy because, he kept going back to the drugs. He kept going back, and he's, around the house, and he's in front of the children, and the wife doesn't want him exhibiting these babies, and he's, abusive to her and so on. And they just get tired of it and they're done with it. So this is a loving family that this guy comes from, but he is homeless and out on the streets, and the family, basically, other than the father, is just wants to be rid of him.
Right. Well, and that's why you need the law enforcement to come in. But family in other situations can be a very important lifeline. And that's one of the things we actually talk about in the book. One of the things we recommend, which is reuniting homeless with the family. I mean, take the father in your instance. If you could actually connect this person with his father, maybe he could have a better shot at helping him, getting him enrolled into a rehab center, something along those lines. So using the family as a bridge and as a means to help the people is a strategy we need to be pursuing, because everybody's different and everybody's situation is different. And that's where the flexibility has to come in line. We have to think broadly. And in those instances where their family can help, it exists and it's in a position to help, we need to take advantage of that. Won't always be the case, may not be the case most of the time, but where it is, it could be a very effective means to kind of help the people kind of get the help they need.
Yeah, I mean, there's stories out of my community where they've reunited daughter with mother, where mother didn't know where daughter was for 5 years and wanted to find her, couldn't find her, had no idea where she was. Reunited them. Now she's living with her mother again. So, but it takes those one-on-one interactions, which takes a lot of resources. But when you consider the money that they blow on building housing and so on, I mean, if it was focused in the right direction.
And one of the things we keep focusing on is take all the money we're spending cleaning up after the problem, right? And that's just managing the problem. And we haven't talked about the diseases on the street and all of those issues, drug needles. I have a friend, when he was living in San Francisco, he wouldn't sit on the BART in the morning because he read one too many stories of somebody sitting on a dirty needle. And he just, you could say he was a little too paranoid, but case is he wouldn't sit down. That's not a way for people to live. And again, there's all sorts of costs involved. And we need to stop spending money cleaning up the problem and actually devote that towards, if we can empower the law enforcement so they could actually enforce the law and get the law enforcement connected to agencies that could then help that person. Maybe it is reconnect with their family, whatever the case may be. Law enforcement is constantly interacting with the community. They're a great resource that we're just not using to its extent. And that's another important area that we need to leverage.
Mm-hmm. And just change the attitude that it's compassionate to allow people to sleep on the sidewalk. What is compassionate about that? To have people sleeping like dogs out on a sidewalk, and that's supposed to be acceptable, that we're supposed to allow that? I mean, that's what that court is basically saying, as opposed to recognizing, wait a minute, this is not humane to have people living on sidewalks. It's not humane to them, and it's not humane to the residents in the community to have this. Have to be walking by people with mental illnesses and addictions and often resorting to crime. And this is what you have to bring your children around. I mean, as I said, I don't encourage anyone to visit Venice right now, because it is a very nasty place right now, and it's turned a beautiful community into something that the residents are deserting. They're leaving because it's just not livable.
And that was one of the things all four of us could 100% agreed upon, is that what we're doing now is not the humane solution. And we talk as if allowing someone to live on the streets is a humane way to deal with this problem. And it absolutely is not. And the economic damages are beginning to mount too. And that is real. That's people, businesses there. It could be a family business in Venice. Its entire livelihood is being harmed because people aren't going there. And now you have a family business. People were living very well, and now they're being significantly, they're having significant pain. That's not right either. That's not humane either.
And you have major corporations now that are in Venice, Google being one. I forget some of the others, but major names. I think Snapchat is there. I don't know what those guys are doing about it. You would think that they would be trying to implement or help with some solutions, but I haven't heard of any.
I haven't heard of any either. But if they got involved, that would be great. If they could, I think echo what we're saying, which is that the humane way of dealing with this problem is to get people housed, to get them off the streets, and to sustainably address it. And also to realize, and this is something that Chris writes about a lot, which is that all we've done is taken those who are homeless from mental illness or for substance abuse. We've just taken them out of one institution and put them into another, which is out of the streets or the jail. And that's not a way to help people with mental illness or substance abuse issues.
So what was the change you always kind of hear about from the 80s that supposedly Reagan changed as far as, psychiatric wards and taking people there against their will? What was the change that was made in the 80s, and in what ways do you think it's maybe gone too far in the other direction?
Well, I think it's gone too far in the other direction, and Chris is the real expert on this, is that we basically shut them down. I mean, if you have that division of One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right, that type of institutional kind of abuse. And so that concept, in the name asylum is, so there's all that negative connotation of imprisoning people in a awful situation. And what that's in effect done is, I think we're down to about, a fraction of the beds in mental health institutions today than compared to where we had in the 80s. So we've had basically those people have been let out. They haven't been treated, or they're not on a sustainable path, but they're just basically let out. And as opposed to actually being, and this shouldn't be a surprise, they're not equipped to take care of themselves. They're not equipped to kind of become part of society and build a home for themselves. And so they end up on the streets. They end up, breaking the law, going to jail, interacting with cops, often then getting involved in drugs. And so they get in this vicious cycle. And so they are being institutionalized. That's the way Chris puts it. I think it's a great image of they're just in jails, not getting the help they need, or they're living on the streets, not getting the help they need. We're still paying the cost. And this is not a humane way of dealing with people who, people do have substance abuse problems. People do have mental illness. We need to face it and ask ourselves some hard questions about how you actually help them.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably a bigger problem than ever. Mental illness and addiction certainly seems to be at highs in America right now. And I usually point to, I think, the general breakdown of the nuclear family in America. The nuclear family just is not today what it once was. The number of kids being raised in single parent households or in abusive households or in absent parent situation households. And, if a child doesn't have a nice, secure, safe home with two loving parents, the likelihood for later mental illness and addiction goes way up. And I think that's what we're seeing with this, the painkiller addiction, the mental illness that we see that's causing homelessness. And also, I think a cause of the rise in all these mass shootings and so on. So that's a real root problem, I think.
Right. And all of this is interrelated, right? I mean, it's hard to know where does one of those problems start and where does one of them stop? They bleed into one another. So yeah, and we need to address all of those in the same way that we need to make housing affordable. It's almost a root problem. And if you don't get to that root, you're not going to sustainably address it.
So let's talk before we wrap up about affordable housing, because I know that's kind of your area of expertise. One thought I have about that is I kind of put that lower on the list when I think of things as far as causing homelessness, just because, yes, housing is expensive in certain areas in Los Angeles by the beaches, obviously, but you go just a bit east, say to Riverside, and you're now in a very affordable housing area, comparable to most parts of the U.S. So my point being that people who are of right and sound mind, they recognize that, if Los Angeles has become too expensive for me, then I need to move somewhere where I can afford, and they move east. Now, maybe that means a longer commute, or maybe it means they find a job closer to where they move to, but they make the rational decision to live in a less expensive area. These people that are homeless, most of them are not making rational decisions.
Right. Well, and I think I need to say this. I think Chris would agree with you, and he would say absolutely. My perspective, when you're saying it's comparable, not really. Even Riverside, housing affordability is not nearly what it is in many other areas.
But you can also get a smaller place, So there are options for less expensive housing if you're using your head.
Absolutely, but you're also you're more vulnerable, and I think that's the relevant point is that if things go well, you'll be just fine. If you lose your job, right, or if you have an adverse life event, a health issue, a divorce, I mean, whatever the case may be, you could start into a spiral, a debt spiral, and you're more vulnerable to that when the necessities cost that much more.
No, I
And
agree. I
that's
mean, it puts you, yeah, it puts you into that potential more likely, but just,
right.
but also again, as I distinguish people of sound mind, even if you're put in a situation where you couldn't even afford the small apartment in Riverside, you would be reaching out to friends and family and shacking up with friends or family. If you're of sound mind, I mean, there's very few people that don't have any friends or any family that would help out in a pinch.
You know, I think it's hard to be able to say, you're saying across everyone, even if that's 90% of people that's in that situation, you still have a small minority that may not have family to reach out to. And I would say if you actually look at the surveys in terms of why somebody is homeless, economic reasons are one of the primary drivers. So, as a share of the population, right, 161,000 compared to 31 million, you're talking about, thank God, a small percentage. So even if you're talking about 90% of the people that would get into trouble, they're going to have family, 95, 99, you still have a vulnerable population that was put in that position because housing is unnecessarily expensive. And there are, when you look at housing shortages, there's a huge shortage of housing, a huge backlog. And so those costs, those excessive costs, that backlog of housing, the shortages, they do create financial stresses. And I think when you look at kind of the population that's homeless, there are people out there that have, in effect, been pushed over that edge. I think I've come to the point in my research where I've said whether it's 10%, 50%, or 90% is not as important as those people need to be helped in a different manner than those who are on the street because of addiction and those who are on the street because of mental illness. And we need to target the problem and the programs to address the causes of that individual's homelessness. And that's why the nonprofits we think are so important. They do that. And so if there's a small number that's from the economic, if you're right, and there's just very few, then we won't need that many of those programs. But those who are there have the support to get them out, and then put more resources towards those who are mental illness.
And what is your proposed solution for more affordable housing?
Well, zoning regulation reform, right? We need more duplexes and triplexes on lots, so we can expand the number, get rid of rent control. Rent control is, I think it was Thomas Sowell who said it was the greatest way to destroy a city other than bombing it was through rent control. So we need to get rid of that. CEQA reform so that we can reduce the time to build. I mean, all of these proposals that would reduce the cost to build, the environmental mandates, and having to put a solar panel on a new house, that adds $1,000. Those types of things build up. So you could lower the cost to build and expand the supply, and you could do it faster. And so now we're just talking just simple Econ 101, right? If the demand is exceeding the supply because of regulations, remove those regulations, expand out supply, costs will come down.
Yeah, but when climate change is determined to be the number one as an existential threat and more important than homelessness, right, which seems to be the agenda right now, climate change is ahead of homelessness as far as importance to people running California. So forget the idea of reducing regulations on home building.
And I guess that is the battle that we have, but and that's the problem. I believe global climate change is real. It's happening, but it's you've got to balance it against all the other things that are out there. And I would say to a lot of homeless people, I think there are other concerns that are more important, and we're making it more difficult for them. And you're right; it is a policy trade-off. And what people are basically saying is that this regulation is worth your homelessness, and that's a trade-off they're willing to make, which to me, I find that difficult to swallow.
Well, California thinks that we're going to independently solve climate change in the world. So here's the globe, and here's California, and somehow by us reducing our emissions by 10% or whatever, we're going to end climate change.
Mind you, by the way, California's emissions reductions have been less than the reductions you've seen nationally. I don't think people recognize that. A lot of that is because we keep ramping up solar power, we keep ramping up wind power, but we keep shutting down nuclear power. And nuclear is zero emissions, so we're trading one low emission source for another, making the grid less reliable. But the emissions have fallen less in California than they have nationally when you look at the peak from 2007.
Wow. And not to mention that I saw a study that said something like 15 to 20% of California's pollution comes from China. So we're right on the coast. Here's China, probably the biggest polluter in the world, right?
They are.
And a good percentage of California's pollution we get from China. So, and yet we just independently enact these shoot yourselves in the foot environmental policies without requiring any commensurate policy from China.
No, that's right. And you have India that's still building lots of coal mines. You have China still building lots of, coal-powered plants. China building coal power plants. So it is a very complex issue. The bottom line is that the technology is not there yet. And maybe if we can solve the battery storage issue and we can solve this shortage of minerals, that's something people don't talk about. But right now, the available supply of the rare earth elements isn't anywhere close to, I just saw the statistic today. We need, in order to just electrify the federal government's fleet of cars, which is something Biden wants to do, the US needs to increase its output of rare earth elements 12 times, 12-fold increase in the amount of earth elements that we are currently bringing out of the ground, which, mind you, environmentalists won't let you do because it's dirty mining. We can't electrify the car fleet.
Or we'll have to get it from China.
Well, the Chinese won't sell it anymore.
They're
hoarding it. So there's a coming shortage. That's one of the things they don't talk about, but there's a coming shortage of the rare earth elements that you need for electric batteries. By the way, for your smartphones, for your windmills, for your solar panels. We're off of homelessness now, but when you talk about the trade-off, we're saying we're going to make someone homeless to do a policy which we can't do.
Yeah.
And to me, that's part of the problem.
And by the way, you're an economist. Have you ever seen a study on the benefits of climate change? The benefits of the world being 1-2 degrees warmer than it is today? Because I'm sure there's negatives to it and there's positives, but I never hear about the positives.
No, I don't either. And I try to stick to the economics, not the science. So I leave that to others.
Yeah. Well, for instance, I know that there's some trade routes in the north that become available that makes it a hell of a lot more efficient to have goods go through some northern pass. Right. That suddenly becomes available. So
yeah, no,
how many billions of dollars in economic benefit does that provide the world? Not to mention a whole other, in general, it seems to me people think they complain about the cold more than they complain about the heat, it seems to me. So,
well, that's something Bjorn Lomborg writes about. I don't know if you've seen his work where he'll talk about cold is a bigger killer than extreme heat. And so he talks about, you're saying the trade-off, and he gets into that. And I think I'm pretty certain he finds that there's still a net negative from global warming, but it's not nearly the negative. It's not the end of the world. I think he says it's like the equivalent of 2 or 3% of global GDP, which is a bad recession, but it's not the end of the world. And then again, that's the point, that there are benefits, there are costs. It looks like their costs are negative on net, but it's not the end of the world. So we need to act responsibly. And even if it were, you never hear people say the building's on fire, so you should run around, panic, and scream. You need to have an intelligent way of dealing with it.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just wrap with this, since we're jumping around, is the same thing that you see it with COVID, is that you hear the benefits of a lockdown as far as it keeping the COVID numbers down and so on, but nowhere in this analysis, when we look at what the benefits would be of a lockdown, do we see the detriments of a lockdown? There's, it's all about listen to the doctors, listen to the scientists, but what about listen to the economists and all the detrimental effects of a lockdown? And then you just have to balance those two. So, okay, you're going to save a few more lives, but you're going to cost lives here and cost long-term this and long-term this. We don't see any balancing at all.
Right. Well, there's a famous quote, right? There are no solutions, only trade-offs.
Thank you again to Wayne Weingarten. You can go to Amazon and get his book, No Way Home, The Crisis of Homelessness and How to Fix It. Also, you can check out his work at the Pacific Research Institute website. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.